record the conversation.
Now this is KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's Mae Brussell, and this is World Watchers number 641, March the 19th, 1984. We begin the program, many of you are familiar, some of you are new listeners, with a brief description of what we were sharing last year, a year ago tonight, to see how the news was flowing then and the continuity between then and now. I was referring to part 3 of Gulf and Western Corporation. Charles Bluhdorn had died last year. He was the head of Gulf and Western Corporation. And on part 3, I was going into his travels from Vienna in 1942, at the time of the war, World War II, to the United States, and how he worked himself up to be 50th in the Fortune 500 in 1982. I was listening today on the radio and heard that cocaine traffic, not heroin or marijuana, cocaine traffic is 8th in the United States in terms of $40 billion a year. Right now, it's between, I think, Ford Motor Company and IBM, $40 billion in cocaine. I just thought of the Fortune 500 because it's on the list there. I watched the travels of Mr. Bluhdorn, and of course a lot more comes out about these people once they pass away, because the obituary gives information we never would have otherwise. And Gulf and Western, the article about him in Wall Street Journal described his longtime associate Arthur Lyman, Liman, who was a partner in the law firm of Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. Now, Simon Rifkin is the attorney who set up TCI with Otto von Bolschwing. That was the head of Hitler's intelligence. He was over Adolf Eichmann, actually, came to the United States and placed Helene vonDamm as secretary to Reagan, and she's back in Vienna, the very city that Otto Skorzeny and Mr. Bluhdorn and a lot of other people came from. So I was showing the link, Simon Rifkin's office also. That law office is it represents 20th Century Fox, with Marvin Davis and Henry Kissinger's on the board, and Gerald Ford and Madame Chenault of the Flying Tigers, and the late Grace Kelly. The continuity of Gulf and Western with Michael Sindone and the Vatican connections, and the office of Rifkin with TCI and with 20th Century Fox and Bluhdorn. Then there was another story last year about Mike Burke, a happy Yank in Ireland. He was in the OSS with William Sullivan. He worked at Warner Brothers for 18 months when Earl Flynn was making movies there with Ronald Reagan, when Flynn was in the Gestapo. In 1949, he became part of the CIA and was involved with a planned coup in Albania. He worked with the CIA in Poland, Czechoslovakia, with anti-Soviet intelligence people working with our government, and set up the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus in New York City. He became president of Madison Square Garden in 1977, and then Ronald Reagan's first agent, early agent, Sonny Werblin, moved into the Madison Square Garden slot to manage that. And I was talking about the links of Michael Sindona to Madison Square Garden. Michael Sindona is God's banker. Somebody asked me, the author of that book, I forgot, Penny Lernoux is her name, In Banks We Trust. I remember the title, but several weeks ago somebody called and asked me about that book again. In Banks We Trust by Penny Lernoux. It has a lot to do with the CIA and drugs and the SS, the Nazis, and the links of the Nazis to American intelligence and the drug traffic. The connection of Michael Sindona to all of that, a lot of it is in that book that came out 1 year later. There was a $2 billion suit filed against Gulf and Western because of their economic shenanigans in Dominican Republic, 1971 to 78. And of course, Mr. Bluhdorn was very active with sugar and control of Gulf and Western in Dominican Republic. And then I updated the activities of Mr. Bluhdorn with Sonny Werblin and Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney not only for John Hinckley, but for almost everyone from the CIA, from Robert Vesco to the chief Mafia kings and Richard Helms. And Williams represents the 20th Century Fox Group, and has worked with Gulf and Western. And the interconnecting links of Ronald Reagan, of Hollywood, of Errol Flynn, of Paramount Studios, of Michael Sindona. A year ago, we were talking about those things, and as I say, Penny Ledoux has this book out now with some of the interconnecting links, and I think you find them interesting. How many of you saw or didn't see, I don't know if you saw on television, the CNN News, the story of Larry Flynt. He claims he threatened to put a contract out to kill President Reagan. He's talking from Butner, North Carolina, the federal prison. He says, I want to kill him. I want to kill that son of a you-know-what. If I ever get close to him, I'll kill him. Now, this is a perfect place for mind control. Butner is one of the most dangerous experimental places for mind control, and Larry Flynt is in Butner, North Carolina. He said that he's put out a contract to kill 2 federal judges, a dozen federal prison employees, and he said that he arranged the bombing of the Senate building, that he was in Washington at the time the Senate was bombed. He was in Washington because a date was set for him to appear before the Supreme Court. But he's making these statements and he's being investigated for them at the present time. I mentioned earlier on the talk show part of this program before we began World Watchers that just 2 months before the deaths in Jonestown, I had on my regular program that there was this cult down in Guyana, this Jonestown, where he was doing mind control and not forcing them, he conducted his experiments in such a way that members of Jonestown, allegedly a church organization, took signed confessions of murdering public officials. The officials hadn't died yet, but in case they did, members of Jonestown could be blamed. So that they were linked in some way with either provocateur action or kamikaze or whatever. And Jim Jones was certainly linked with the Central Intelligence Agency and California law enforcement and back in Washington, D.C. So these things that Larry Flynt is saying don't make sense at all. And furthermore, there is a big fight that I'm not privy to talk about to get control of the entire Flynt organization. I thought they were through the woods a few weeks ago. I thought the good guys actually won out over the bad guys, but maybe I'm too optimistic. Some people say I'm too optimistic. Not that anyone is particularly good in the outfit. I'm not really familiar with all the things they did before. I'm not saying these people that publish the magazines such as Hustler and Playboy and Penthouse, they have that level that I'm not familiar with. I'm not privy to everything that goes on. But there is a power struggle going on, and I think that they're going to have Larry's brother be made conservator of everything he has because of the mind control that's going on down in Butner right now, North Carolina. It didn't do me any satisfaction to hear Jim Good this week. I was down there and he said, you were right all along about the things you said about what would happen to Larry. I don't want to be proven right. I wish they had taken my advice the very day that he went crazy and was drugged, before all of these compounding problems went on. But you're seeing an absolutely perfect example of confessions of intent to kill, claiming he bombed Washington, that he has a contract on the president, and it's going to get from bad to worse until they do a certain program. I outlined what I think should be done, but that doesn't mean they're going to do it, and I doubt that they will. I think there are ways to handle this, but first you have to admit that the government is capable of those things and has done them. And it's documented how they program people to confess murders and do murders and erase the memory after the murders and claim responsibility for those things. And you have to, once you admit that they do this, then you can find out what happened to him. And the chronology is very simple. But I just don't have that much input there, or not sure that they believe that yet. And by the time they do it, it'll get from bad to worse. Now, I know you read the article about this David Mahonski, who was in front of the White House this week. He was shot in the arm, and he was supposed to be wanting to kill President Reagan. There were several articles about him. I'm not going to have too much, but he was outside the White House, and they put him in a mental hospital, and he claims that Reagan and the FBI and the CIA and Air Force intelligence had drugged him. I don't know how or what. He said he's been in a mental hospital in and out since 1974 for 10 years, And he says the government intelligence put a bug in his head which transmits everything across the country. I don't need to be in another nut ward, he said. The president had me in 3 already. They've put him at St. Elizabeth's Hospital where John Hinckley is. And he said his problems began 10 years ago. He underwent drug treatment in 1978. His family lives in Pennsylvania, but like all of our would-be assassins or alleged assassins or kamikazes, he traveled all over the country. Another one of these unemployed travelers that goes all over the place with no jobs or no means of employment, such as Mark Chapman, who shot John Lennon, or even John Hinckley, whose family was well off, but he zigzagged all around the country, various places with no noticeable means of support, not even from his folks. Now, along with this case, there was a story in the newspaper, the LA Times, that agents in Washington declined comment about the case, but Secret Service Director John Simpson told a congressional hearing in Los Angeles on the Olympic security that Mahonski had intended to shoot at the White House Thursday night. Now, it's very interesting with the talk of kamikazes from other countries or terrorism at the time of the Olympics that an Olympic committee is hearing the story about this particular person who says he has been in the control of federal agents and that they've ruined his life. He said the president and certain elements of the society filled me with drugs. They are dangerous narcotics. He says, like the communist world, he said, I've had about as much as I can take in America. And he claimed that they had a bug in his ear. He wants it out of his ear. He gets messages transmitted. You've heard this before, and there have been experiments on this. And he was in front of the White House, and these messages come to him. He has mobility. He travels around the country. He claims he gets messages. And then at the time that he was in front of the White House, allegedly as a threat, the shooting was observed, this is interesting, by 4 Secret Service agents and a Los Angeles police officer who just happened to be strolling on the sidewalk outside of the grounds. The Los Angeles police officer, Keith Bushey, B-U-S-H-E-Y, said he and his 11-year-old son, Jake, were visiting Washington. And he made some snide remark, if I want to go to Washington to see the White House, it's safer at the Pizza Hut. Now, Mr. Bushey refused to answer any questions. I might remind you that there is no Easter vacation or school vacation at this time in March that Mr. Bushey would take an 11-year-old son, just happened to be in front of the White House at the time that this particular fellow is there. He had a sawed-off shotgun and a bow and arrow in the car, but that isn't the important thing. The important thing is how he traveled. Like John Hinckley spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, in and out, and could be working with people from the LAPD. But he had a lot of time. His name comes up at the Olympic Committee at the security, and an officer from the LAPD is right there in front of the White House with a kid who's not on vacation, who has no reason to be there. This isn't Easter vacation or anything like that. And what a coincidence with all the threat of kamikaze and counterintelligence and agent provocateurs that when this yoke, who says he's programmed by the government, is in front of the White House, a member of the Los Angeles Police Department is there also, and this fellow unemployed is traveling again all over the country. It's expensive, even on the Greyhound bus. But he's traveling around the country, and then they're talking at the Olympic Committee about him and his past. I think that's pretty interesting. We'll watch more. They'll probably clam up on it, but these stories, this kind of a story, and the way they do mind control is interesting to me, and I hope it is to you. There was another story in the LA Herald this week. The district attorney is asking the death penalty for 2 officers of the Los Angeles Police Department. One officer was supposed to get the death penalty, years ago, but they reversed it in 1972. He even wants to be out on parole. But 2 officers were hired for the slaying of a Thomas Weed in February of 1983 for financial gain. They were paid. Members of the Los Angeles Police Department were paid $15,000 for the murder of a Northridge businessman, and furthermore, Weed was the co-owner with Ogilvy, another fellow, of a Ford called the Ford Kennedy Laboratory. Don't you think that's interesting? A cytotoxin testing lab. This partner of Mr. Weed, who was murdered, disappeared. One body was found, one wasn't found, and they also were wanted to be. They were hiring for another murder. The another murder case that they were going to do. The fee was $7,500 to mutilate Weed. Just to think of how Larry Flint was shot in the genitals, and with all the interest in pornography or sex, or you can kill for $15,000. They went for the $15,000 fee, and they also had a contract on another person. They're charged with conspiring attempt to murder a 37-year-old dancer, Joan Loguercio, Loguercio, to collect her $100,000 insurance policy, naming themselves as beneficiaries. So the Los Angeles Police Department has a man in front of the White House when this fellow's there. The fellow says he's programmed, and they're talking about this in LA, and here are cops from the LAPD this year charged with the murdering of one man and being hired to murder another man. Now, when Ronald Reagan was running as president, and as he won the nomination, I had sections of a book on the air on California, the first parafascist state. And it's almost 4 years since I had a few pages or remarks of that on the air. But with the Edwin Meese hearings and the Los Angeles Police Department investigation into the officers and Western goals, and they come together, they're not separate. Edwin Meese, Alfred Bloomingdale, John Reese, Jerry Ducote, Western goals, and their German Vienna and German offices and the Taiwan branch all come together, and they're very important. And I'm going to do a lot on Edwin Meese tonight, and then again to continue on the LAPD. But I just want a few quotes from a book that came out when Reagan was, before he ran for president. This was by Kenneth Lamott. He wrote essays from 1963 to 1971. He graduated from Yale University. He was in the Navy during World War II. He died right after, I'll look up the date, it was right after Reagan's nomination before the inauguration. And he wrote a book on California, the first parafascist state. And we can review these few phrases or even parts of the book every single week if you want until the election. But it's pertinent with Edwin Meese trying to get in to run the Justice Department. Hopefully it can be stopped. Goodness knows I made enough calls, and I hope you wrote some letters. I didn't have time to write letters this week, so I was calling Washington. Mr. Lamont said, I tried to avoid using the word fascism because it brings up an emotional feeling. Yet, he says, it's a matter of degree, and there's comparisons between Germany in the 30s and 40s and California in the 60s and 70s. And remember, California moved to Washington in the 80s. He said, we look nervously around for stormtroopers. We see the Hells Angels, the John Birchers. Those are the ones with the LAPD and the hard hats. We wait for Hitler and Mussolini, and we get Ronald Reagan. The Birchers are not enforcing the Nuremberg laws. The Hells Angels are not operating death camps. And yet he claims there's a danger lurking here, that you don't look for the obvious signals. Kenneth Lamont said something is happening to California, to America's Golden State. From La Jolla in San Diego, and that's where the hunk of loans and Edwin Meese and Pete Wilson and John DeLorean and C. Arnold Smith and La Costa, the crime syndicate and so forth from La Jolla in San Diego, and the Golden Gate Park in Marin and Watts and Palo Alto. The symptoms are ugly and obvious. State leaders make a mockery of the democratic process. Open warfare is waged against dissident use of the state. 1/3 of the population earns a living manufacturing bombs, missiles, and napalm and rockets. And he warns, a graduate of Yale warns about California. He said, and I've had this, I know, on the air maybe twice before, but there are new listeners, and maybe you don't know the book by Mr. Lamont called California, the First Parafascist State. Very important book, published by Little Brown, and you can get it. I'm sure it's hard to find, but I'm sure it's available. He said, California is the distant warning system for the rest of the United States. He wrote that in 1971. California is our window into the future. California is the center of the whirlpool where all the currents come to a focus. The reports from California in 1960s, 70s are the minutes of the next meeting. What is going on here? Something even more dismaying is the disintegration of the state that should have been the brightest and the best. In California, we are governed by charismatic buffoons, men so clownish it's hard to take them seriously as politicians, men who are not reluctant to use their tremendous power. 1/3 of our people who demand production of these various war weapons make it literally the health of the state. We are engaged in open warfare, and the enemy that Goebbels would have is our own people. Technology has triumphed. Public disorder is matched by an index of private distress. And public disorder, of course, Operation Chaos and COINTEL program was Edwin Meese. And he talks about the treatment of the Indians or blacks, the Chicanos, and the apathy and disinterest here, and the similarities between Hitler's Germany and how Edwin Meese and that gang felt that the Californians, the young people, were the enemy to be destroyed. The super hawks run this state, and he gives them words in here that are not very kind, but can be repeated from time to time to let you know that this man, Mr. Lamont, was aware of this a long time ago, and the future has caught up, and it is the present, and we have to live with this, and the best way maybe is to understand the past. There was an article in the Washington Post recently, California County rapidly tightening their grip on the entire Justice Department. This was January 26th, when White House counselor Edwin Meese moves to the Justice Department. Now, hopefully he won't, but think who else is behind him and Ronald Reagan and who they'll put in his place. We're not through the woods yet. It said when he moves, because they assumed in January he would move up, but he's already done the other damage. He will join a network called the Alameda County Mafia, made up of people who were once involved in law enforcement out of Alameda County. From 1959 to 67, Meese was deputy district attorney. His old friend now is at the Justice Department. D. Lowell Jensen has been promoted. He was one of these men with the COINTEL, Operation Chaos, the Squad 19. Lowell Jensen is second under Meese, and they're having a problem getting a special prosecutor because the justice is already stacked with the people from Alameda that worked with Ronald Reagan out here. Lowell Jensen is second under Meese, waiting for Meese to be approved. He was deputy director of the Justice Department in an investigative division, deputy district attorney, went on to be district attorney of Alameda County, and then went on to Washington, D.C. Meese recommended that Jensen be appointed the assistant attorney general in charge of the criminal division when Reagan was president. Then he was promoted to associate attorney general, the number 3 job in the Justice Department. The Justice Department said they expect that Jensen, who is well respected, will fill in with Deputy Attorney General Edward Schmultz, Schmults, who left. He left Washington, D.C., so there is no Deputy Attorney General except Jensen, and Jensen was put in by Edwin Meese, who has to be investigated. And so he worked close with him. Alan C. Nelson, Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization, a branch of the department, was a deputy district attorney in Alameda from 1964 to 69. Nelson left that office and joined Ronald Reagan and served in the California Department of Human Resources. Another Alameda graduate is Lois Harrington, the director of the Office of Justice Assistance, Research, and Statistics. Harrington was a former deputy district attorney in Alameda. He didn't work at the same time at Meese, but she knew him and followed. Harrington serves as chairman of the President's Task Force on Victims of Crime. Roger Olson was deputy district attorney in Alameda County from 1969 to 72. He met Meese there when he was a law clerk, and when Reagan's administration came in 1981, he left his law office to become deputy to Jensen in the criminal division of the Justice Department. Olson is now Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Tax Division. Look how the tax was used by Richard Nixon and the same Watergate people in power now, how they can strike back or hurt. This Justice Department is run by the Alameda County, and it's not Alameda anymore. As Mr. Lamont said, California was the first parafascist state. Now you get the whole network and potential of a fascist nation. Olson is now working in the tax department and was in Alameda County. This is the office where the late Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States, served as district attorney. Think what happened when a president of the United States had his head blown off, and Earl Warren covered up all the evidence of the assassination that changed this country around 20 years ago. He came out of Alameda County. And on the judiciary, to hear Edwin Meese's approval or to vote against him, we now, somebody left me a message. I have a list of judiciary, but I hadn't looked up the names. I forgot that Arlen Specter, the one-gun bullet guy, the bullet 399, who lied about the physical evidence, the bullet that wasn't nicked, that had no blood or flesh, the one that was supposed to go through 7 different locations, through John Kennedy and John Connolly and Connolly's wrist and thigh, and come out clean. He's on the judiciary. Arlen Specter of the CIA is one of the people who will pass on Meese. Earl Warren came out of there. They were active in prosecuting student demonstrations, the Black Panthers. They hired the Hells Angels to attack the anti-war people. And William R. McGinnis, M-C-G-U-I-N-E-S-S, is also a deputy to Jensen. And Marty Jenkins, a lawyer in the Civil Rights Division, was deputy district attorney in Alameda County. And James K. Stewart, director of the National Institute of Justice, served as deputy chief of police in Oakland. That's why I thought it was pertinent to repeat the warnings of California, the first para-fascist state, because the things that Mr. Lamont was talking about, those men have literally taken over various divisions of the Justice Department. Now, for the last several weeks, I've talked about Edwin Meese with his cutting down on the Truth of News, the Foundation of Education and Research up in San Francisco, his personal finances from his home, and the appointments of Mr. McKean to the post office, and Mr. Luce to the, he got an appointment as an alternate to the UN. We talked about those with Meese. They're in the news now, and also the Superfund, his being vice president of Roar Industries that polluted down in in Riverside, and Edwin Meese's control of news in Chicago when Rupert Murdoch moved in. I've done a lot on Edwin Meese. I talked about on Kazoo Meese and the stolen Carter papers before it really made the national splash, the headlines. But there are new items about Meese that I want to run through with you. Some you may have seen and some you may not have seen. Very important, before I get to the LAPD, which isn't separate from this, I want to share these articles about Meese because of the information that some newspapers carry and some don't. I can't assume that you get this material, so we have to run this down together. One story in the LA Times this last week, no cover-up vowed on the Meese panel. This is a quotation from Strom Thurmond, who works with Robert Gray, whose name was on the Carter papers with Edwin Meese, who worked with Frank Turple and was the Senate person in charge of getting rid of John Lennon, the memos on John Lennon. Strom Thurmond says no cover-up. The paper says that at least 8 new witnesses will be called. I hope they bring 100, but they're starting at least, and I'll give you the names of some of them. What brought this ahead, the new matter, besides the old questions, was that $15,000 that his wife borrowed in December 1980. They had a stock purchase dated January 23rd, 1981, 3 days after the inauguration. Remember, several days before the inauguration, there was Richard Allen, who was with the president and had an envelope right after the inauguration that varied. It was supposed to have 100,000 on the outside, but then they said 1,000, and Richard Allen had to retire, was forced out of the National Security Council, chief advisor there because of that scandal. Well, at the time Richard Allen was getting his little pays from Japan, and I had my theory about what that was about. I think it was delivering John Lennon so we wouldn't have any more protests when Ronald Reagan would bring us into the war or put the missiles around like he's doing in the bloodbath in Central America and so forth. At this time in December of 1980 and right after inauguration in 81, we now have 2 people involved with money transactions, but his wife borrowed this money. It was in her name, and it's a federal crime, of course, not to list. This money he didn't tell the Senate Judiciary, and he didn't declare when he was appointed about this money. It's supposed, if you have 1,000 or more, you're supposed to talk about. The money came from Edwin Thomas, another man who later was promoted. He became regional administrator of the General Services Administration in San Francisco. That was the 5th appointment related to Meese at the time based upon these financial transactions, and now I have up to 8 people that got government appointments, and it all had to do with his the money that he needed. to move to Washington. That was the alleged excuse. Now, a lot of people have moved from their home states to Washington, and nobody was more prepared than the Meese family. They had been waiting years for Reagan to get in the White House, so it didn't come as a surprise that they were going to have to make a move. We'll take a 1-minute break before I get on to more to the Edwin. Now we'll begin side 2 of World Watchers. This is broadcast number 641, March 19th, 1984. Now the Meese family borrowed, Mrs. Meese borrowed this $15,000 from a person who had worked with Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan for a long time, and bought into a company, a very interesting company, owned by Dr. Earl Bryan. Now, I was down in L.A. all this week, so I didn't get a chance to go to my old files on Ronald Reagan. But if you didn't live in California, you wouldn't know the name. If you live in California and you look up the Reagan, you will find Dr. Earl Bryan, a very controversial person who now has a corporation called Biotech Corporation. Now, at the time that they're moving, and he's borrowing $40,000 or $60,000, she claims that she needs money to put the children through college. Sure, they go to, whether it's Harvard, Princeton, and Yale at the same time. It's a hard time to get kids in college if you incur a debt of $16,000. Why not borrow to the college and pay them back? And you wouldn't lose money on that. Just put it right to the college and borrow it. There must be an easier way to pay for college tuition than for her to put $15,000 into Biotech in New York. Dr. Earl Bryan is the head of Biotech. He's a long friend of Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan. He was the director of California Health, Education, and Welfare when Reagan was governor. He was there until 1974. Now, HEW in California was tied to the federal HEW program, Dr. Jolly West at UCLA with the mind control programs, with NASA, with the Los Angeles Police Department. This was a very controversial time, and he was a very controversial person. And Edwin Meese, operating with the COINTEL program with Operation Chaos, was borrowing money as late as 1980 from an old person who worked with Meese and Reagan when all of those operations and mind control and experimentation were going on in California. I'll have more on Bryan. I'll look up some more on him, Dr. Earl Bryan, but a very controversial person. Now, Biotech is described as a business development, a company that invests in small firms entering the field of biotechnology, medical, and nuclear science companies. Talk about Brave New World and California, the first fascist state. She sold her stock in May 83, but the loan was made to Thomas. Now, he went on, the fellow that made the loan, who's a good friend of Reagan's, he went on to become head of the General Services Administration in California, and there are branches of the General Services Administration that have been investigated recently. So why Biotech? If they needed the money for the college, why go into debt $16,000? And they borrowed the money to do it, just as he did with his home. They knew they had to move to Washington. They had school-aged children. Why take out a loan at the time that they need their education? And you don't know, if the market goes down and the stock goes down, you get a loss on the stock. Why not take it right for the college and plunk it right with the college and give them their tuition? Thomas worked with Reagan. He was on his staff when he was governor. And in 1981, after Reagan was inaugurated, Mrs. Thomas, also friend of Meese and Reagan's, bought into Biotech. Between them, they have between $50,000 and $100,000 shares. Now, another situation came out with the Carter Papers this week, where an aide to Mr. Edwin Meese told the Senate Judiciary that they had lost a note. They couldn't find a note on the case of the Carter Papers that was available before. And the note was from somebody named Roger Stone, who was an informant for the GOP, a spy in McGovern's camp at the time of Watergate. So the Richard Nixon spy, he was only 19 years old. He was in political intelligence for Nixon in 72. Now he's sending letters to Meese in 1983, or not 80, when the election is going on, when Reagan is debating Jimmy Carter, saying he kept it. There's a memo saying he kept his mouth shut so they can't touch him when he was spying on McGovern. So this came out this week also. Now the witnesses to be called: Edwin Thomas of the General Services in California, who loaned Mrs. Meese the $16,000, will be called. Earl Bryan of Biotech will be called as a witness. Mr. Ted Elkin, a prominent man in real estate in Southern California, was the man who had the money, who gave it to Thomas Barrack Jr., the $70,000 that he gave to Meese. He's going to be called as a witness. General William Burkman, Chief of the Army Reserve, is to be called as a witness. Joseph Sullivan Jr., who figured in Meese's getting a transfer and a promotion to colonel in the reserves, is to be called. The Army Inspector General had said that the transfer and the promotion of Meese shouldn't have occurred, so the Inspector General may be there. And Jan Schmidt, SCHMITT, the loan officer from Great American Federal Savings and Loan in San Diego, who allowed Meese to fall back 15 months in one of the payments, will be called as a witness. Now, that's a nice, juicy bunch of witnesses. Edwin Meese had a press conference and sent a note to Senator Thurmond that he was putting off the investigation for a while. I did go back. I had time to go back to my files. Not a complete thing on Gordon Luce, but just mention him in 1980. He's the fellow from San Diego who got an appointment with the UN, who got this juicy loan for Edwin Meese. And I believe the story, of course, is much bigger than the figures they're throwing around, but it's going to be a big stumbling block because I'm sure they're not going to want to go into these various characters. He was the chief executive officer, chairman of the board of San Diego Federal Savings before he got the promotion by Reagan, or part-time, with the United Nations. And in 1980, November, just right after the election and 2 months before the inauguration, there was a story in Wall Street Journal and in the Chronicle how the savings and loan will have a friend in the Reagan regime, that his election will ease taxes on interest from savings accounts, that there'll be bigger benefits that'll come from savings and loan, and that Gordon Luce was a close advisor to Ronald Reagan. He was a member of Reagan's Executive Advisory Committee, his housing task force, and that the banks would have some advantages, the savings and loans, with Reagan as the governor, and that Mr. Gordon Luce, who had helped raise money for Reagan, who now it turns out got the loans for Edwin Meese and got appointment in Washington, was always close to Meese as a fundraiser to Ronald Reagan, close to Edwin Meese. And he wanted banking laws changed. He got Meese his loan, then he went on to get an appointment and wanted to affect the banking laws in favor of the particular area of the bank that he's interested in. The San Francisco Chronicle had another story on that interest-free loan, that $15,000, determining whether a special prosecutor will be needed or not. Meese failed to disclose the loan that he had from 1981 to 82. Financial disclosure reports are required by Ethics in Government Act. It's against the law. He's going to be the Attorney General, and it's against the law not to declare if you got the loan, which he didn't do. He also failed to disclose the loan to the Senate Judiciary. He sent a letter, "I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you." Well, that's pretty sad. And this article said it's a violation of a federal law to award a federal job in return for any financial consideration or any favor of value or any promise of either, besides the fact that he didn't disclose this money. Now, just running down the Edwin Meese story to summarize some of the stuff we've had before or to keep it up to date, at the San Diego Savings and Loan, Mr. Ed Gray was there from San Diego, and then he was appointed by Ronald Reagan. This is the bank that gave Edwin Meese these favors. Gray was appointed to head the Federal Home Loan Bank Board for the federal government when Reagan came in. Gordon Luce, who I mentioned, from the San Diego Bank, was named to the U.S. mission to the United Nations. Now, Meese fell on 34 payments to the bank. These two men got appointments. He hadn't made any money on 34 payments over 2 years until the Washington Post had a story, and then some money quickly was put in there. Instead of foreclosing him as the loans were going on and he wasn't paying on those, they offered him a fourth mortgage. The third person who got a boost by Reagan was Thomas Barrack, California developer who was the middleman for Mr. Elkin I mentioned. When he was the one who raised the $70,000 for the Meese homes for Meese to get that money. And 2 weeks after that, Mr. Burke went to Washington, D.C. to discuss a federal appointment and was named Assistant Secretary of the Interior after he helped be the middleman between Elkin and Meese to get the money. John McKean has been in the news quite a bit, who arranged the $180,000 loan, and a month later was offered the U.S. Postal Service Board of Governors. Edwin Thomas, who I talked about, arranged the Mrs. Meese loan. He became the California head of the General Services Administration. There was an Army promotion of a fellow in the reserves who was supposed to retire. After they got Edwin Meese promoted and became the colonel, he wasn't supposed to have it. The papers had lapsed and he was not supposed to be in reserve. This fellow went on to become head of a department in the Army that he was interested in. Edwin Thomas's wife, Gretchen Thomas, was named by Ronald Reagan as an attorney examiner to preside over the she was official and is for the Merit System Protection Board in San Francisco. After her husband got a $16,000 loan for the Meese family, which wasn't declared, then Mrs. Thomas got an appointment by Ronald Reagan in California for the Merit Systems Protection Board. Now, Mrs. Thomas's boss in Washington, D.C., he worked at the White House, Herbert E. Ellingwood. He was a longtime associate of Edwin Meese, and he worked very closely, with Meese and the Thomases and Ronald Reagan. And when the loan was given to Mrs. Meese, the $16,000, Mrs. Thomas was working for Mr. Ellingwood. So Ronald Reagan named him chairman of the U.S. Merit Systems Protection in San Francisco. Then Mrs. Thomas joined as an official out there. So that you have the wife, the boss of the wife of the man who raised the money for Mrs. Meese, getting an appointment, and then the wife who worked with this fellow getting the job with him in San Francisco. So we have here 8 jobs just having to do with Edwin Meese's house. Would you believe that one? Selling a house. How many politicians have moved to Washington, D.C. and had so much clout? We don't know about all the other stories because his troubles began in June 82, and that is the date that I said 88 banks were affected in Europe, and money was tied up. That the Japanese bank, the Sumitomo, is now bailing out the Vatican Bank to pay back the 88 banks, and I believe with Licio Gelli and Michael Sindona and God's bankers working with the campaigns of Reagan and Richard Nixon, that it had more to do with other debts. I'll just bet you that if this evolves, it'll go deeper and deeper. This isn't just that a man who's worked for Ronald Reagan is a law enforcement person in Alameda, has brought his whole team to Washington, the whole gang with him, 7 or 8 of those. I can't believe that he sold a house in San Diego and couldn't find one in Washington, D.C., and hadn't figured out how to get the kids to college. They've been probably college preparatory since kindergarten. He hadn't figured that one out. So that all these appointments and all of this promotion of jobs has to do with Edwin Meese. And in addition to the $16,000 that Mrs. Meese has, Ursula Meese, in Dr. Earl Bryan's little company that we have to do a little more investigation, the biotech, she also owns stock in the American Cystogenetics. It's a biotech subsidiary that has to do with genetics. I'm sure it has to do probably with genetic engineering. Who would know? But I'm suspicious of these people and what they have in these biology labs and in the genetics and so forth. But it's interesting, considering California, the first para-fascist state, that she also has worked in the American Cyto, C-Y-T-O, genetics. So Edwin Meese not only works with the COINTEL program, with the Operation Chaos, with the counterintelligence activity in the state of California, slamming down the hippies, the People's Park, the Isla Vista. I've run it down so many times. She has stock in the American Cytogenetics and the biotech which is interesting. And also she omitted this from her financial statement. She sold that in April of '83. Anything over $1,000 they're supposed to declare, and she didn't do it. So our Attorney General has his finger into biotech stocks, to energy, to atomic companies that have to do with medicine, and genetic firm. Where does it end, considering Stanford research and the use of these people that he's associated with for experiments and mind control and genetic altering? This is California, the first parafascist state. Another article in the Los Angeles Times this week, Meese charges the critics are giving personal attacks and that he'll clarify his position. He said he blames the people who are attacking them as being unfair, that they're questioning his qualifications, they're impugning my character, and they're reflecting on me and my family. Well, it's his family that took the loan. I mean, how long can you yell about it being unfair? It was his wife who didn't disclose, and the LA Times called attention to it, that they didn't disclose the $15,000 interest-free loan that his wife got, a loan with no interest to biotech, to Earl Braun, of all things, in New York City, and goodness knows what that lab is. So he's trying to say that the committee is unfair, that they have false and misleading statements. It's election year, and Congressman Metzenbaum said, I'm not up for an election, and I'm not endorsing anything. Now, the one sentence in the LA Times that caught my eye was this. It said the officials, when they learned about Mrs. Meese's interest-free loan, expressed anguish at Meese's failure to make known the $15,000 loan, even though he had undergone weeks of briefing and simulated questions by the Justice Department and White House attorneys. Do you remember the Carter briefings that Ronald Reagan got with George Will and Jeane Kirkpatrick, and the people, sitting old Ronald Reagan on a bench and giving him the stolen papers from the National Security Council and briefing him? Our Attorney General is getting briefing, and I'm sure, see what happens is with the CIA having their finger with all these general people and the spies, even the old Watergate spies from the McGovern years, having their fingers in the Carter-Meese papers, the Carter-Reagan papers going to Meese and Robert Gray in that game. I'm sure they know what he's going to be asked, you see, and they have reason to know the question. So they brief him, and he's had weeks. He's sat on that stool with his dunce cap while they give him weeks of briefing and simulated questions. Simulated, I'll bet you anything those are stolen. I'll bet you they know everything that he's going to be asked. But he forgot to mention the $16,000 and the extra in the genetic concern. Let's see what they do. What are they altering genes for? What purposes? It'd be interesting to know what Gretchen Thomas and Ursula Thomas have in these manufacturing of these biotechnic, whatever they are. They're investments for chemical and experimental laboratories. Goodness knows what they are. So anyway, the appointment of the Mrs. Thomas, and after having stocks there and having an investment, probably encouraging Mrs. Meese to put money into Mr. Bryan, Dr. Bryan's corporation, then they go on to San Francisco and get jobs with her boss. Mrs. Thomas, the LA Times says, is an attorney. She was interviewed, and she was recommended to the San Francisco Regional Director by Richard Redenius, Redenius, who's the managing director of the board that she was assigned to. They acknowledged that Mr. Ellingwood, who worked for Ronald Reagan in Washington and earlier when he was governor, told Redenius that she wanted to be considered for the job. They didn't endorse her skills, and the man who made the transition, the appointment, said he was barred by privacy considerations from discussing her previous legal experience, but she was hired out in San Francisco September 5th, 1982, and has an important job in San Francisco. Well, that's enough on Edwin Meese with the appointments, the promotions. There's a good chance, very good chance, going that he will not be appointed, but that doesn't mean you can't call the Senate Judiciary. If you don't have the number, call the Senate offices in Washington, D.C., and ask for any of the members, whether it's Strom Thurmond or in Hatch. I called Mr. Hatch's office, and Strom Thurmond, I called the people who want him and said, what are you proposing here? Do you want another Watergate? You're going to have a crook on your hands and it's going to get worse. And that's the truth. I mean, they should know that Edwin Meese is trouble. They all were for him, and now that all these names are coming out, it's going to slow down, and I hope that he doesn't go through with this. But the Justice Department is stacked now with the gang from Alameda. So who would be the next appointee as Attorney General? It'd be funny to put someone from the East with the California Alameda Mafia there, but that's the way it goes out here in California. They have groomed and nurtured, in California, the first para-fascist state, those people that would be Ronald Reagan's aides when the Garden Plot takes over, when he has his coup or his chaos, his Operation Chaos on a grand scale. Now to go on with the last 10 minutes, update you with one or two stories of the LAPD. It's complicated for some of you who pick up in the middle of a broadcast or a broadcast for the first time. I should give a brief resume every week, a little bit of it, on the trial that's going on. To refresh your memory, there were 131 plaintiffs suing the Los Angeles Police Department for keeping files on them that were ordered destroyed in 1975 and that were being fed into computers and kept after 1976 that were never destroyed. And they were from the intelligence file, photographs, names of people, anti-war protesters, anti-atomic bomb protesters, pro-abortion, you name it, people against police repression, which is a legitimate concern with the squads down there. And these various plaintiffs settled out of court for a suit over $1 million with the Los Angeles Police Department, the law office of Ronald Reagan and William French Smith representing the LAPD, and all of the files had to do with papers when Ronald Reagan was governor, with Jerry Ducote spying for him and John Reese of Western Goals. And then in May of last year, it turned out that the intelligence files were being put into a $100,000 computer run by a combination of the Defense Department with former Chief of Staff Admiral Moore, Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, Roy Cohn with his Mafia syndicate connections, Larry McDonald as chairman of the Birch Society with his Murder Incorporated, his tangled connections to Chile and Lebanon and the Habash family, and a lot more. The computer was paid for by Representative Larry McDonald and his group, this combination, and Mr. John Singlaub, famous warrior, now working with the Anti-Communist League, the Nazis from World War II out of Taiwan, a smorgasbord of agents of past assassinations, the Defense Department, the Mafia, and hit teams and information, then going to Germany, to the German intelligence, and to Vienna in Austria at the present time. So that when the LAPD settled the case in Los Angeles, that was not the entire end of the case, because a lot of the papers that were in J. Paul's garage that went to Western Goals were ordered to be destroyed, and plaintiffs found information in there. So now they're having hearings by the police board on what to do with the people involved in feeding the computer, two-way computer, back and forth between Los Angeles and Alexandria, Virginia. And the only reason this came up was that papers in the original lawsuit against the police department were in J. Paul's garage, but these computers can be in every major city of the United States, and they are. Only you people aren't having lawsuits, so you don't know where Western Goals has their computers. Now, after the story got really dangerous in terms of linking a lot of major police officers, some of them retired that were involved in this mess. A lot of the guilty government people, of course, retire right away, so they can say they were former, they're not still with us, and that makes it all look very nice. Retired Captain John W. Thompson was with the Police Intelligence Department, and he retired when this scandal broke. He was active head of the Intelligence Division when J. Paul was building his database with the computer and putting material in there. Thompson helped write the guidelines in 1975 that the material should be destroyed in 1976, yet his initials are on reports spying on a Judge Pact in Los Angeles in 1977, and the fact that they had these former papers. He wrote the guidelines in 76, so they were clearly breaking the law. in 1983 when the files showed up in Mr. Paul's garage, including papers on Judge Pack. Thompson testified at one time that officers were not allowed to routinely copy intelligence reports from the police and keep copies outside the division, and he testified that he didn't authorize J. Paul to take them home. And yet there's information in these reports that suggests that Mr. Gates of the police department asked Mr. Thompson to get background reports from Western Goals and from the John Birch Society, and that he knew it did in fact exist. Another man who retired, who was to be testifying again this week, he moved up to Nevada, was Captain Robert Lewis. He refused to come back to L.A. to testify. He was head of the intelligence division of the police department when the computer was set up, when J. Paul was setting a database. You see, John Reese, his wife, Louise Reese, worked with Senator Joe McCarthy. He worked active, he came to this country in 1963 with the House and the Senate Intelligence Investigating Committees. He continued where Joe McCarthy left off and had died, with smears, innuendos he sends out through his Intelligence Digest, information, address, telephone number of various people who, these are all people who haven't committed a crime. As a matter of fact, part of his Intelligence Digest, I saw the name Lloyd Bridges and Jeff Bridges, 244 Loring Drive, or 224. They used to live 2 houses from us in L.A. They're friends of ours, and I sent them this information. I said, are you aware that your name is in John Reese's files? They never answered. I guess they don't care. They're people who don't care. Actors, musicians, writers, they have just all kinds of people that you wouldn't even think were political. You can't think of one political thing Lloyd Bridges ever did, I'm sure. But his name is there, and I have a list of a lot of other people, because they're friends of mine. I wrote to them, but they don't seem to be interested. Now, Captain Loomis was the head of the Intelligence Division. He retired, and Charles B. Russell retired. All of them retired, of course, in 1973 when the story began to break, and they were forced to quickly get out. Russell retired in July 83, 2 months after files were found in J. Paul's garage that he authorized. They were found in May, and in July he quits. He was at the time in charge of the Pacific National Bank, of airport security, of bomb squads, of the nuclear emergency in Nevada, and he's working with hearsay, innuendo, law-abiding citizens, material that was supposed to have been destroyed. Now, some of the men changed agencies, which gets even more dangerous, and I'm going this background because next week we'll go right to the LAPD story probably and continue. There's some very important new information on it, but it's so important I want to get to the background here. Lieutenant Thomas Schiller was in charge of the police intelligence, that special squad, which is the counterintelligence that can have the kamikaze teams, the terrorists, the bomb squads, the guys like that one standing in Los Angeles, in Washington rather, the brain-controlled fellow who claims he's part of an experiment, that kind of person. Lieutenant Thomas Schiller left the PDID when it was being exposed by J. Paul, and then went on to the Anti-Terrorist Division, which is worse. They're in charge of the Olympic Games and the so-called anti-terrorist group. Captain John Cleghorn, Cleghorn, took over from Mr. Scheidecker to be in charge of the police intelligence and J. Paul. He went on to the Anti-Terrorist Division in the spring of '82 and is in charge with them along the Olympic security. And Lieutenant Charles Kilgo from the Police Department Intelligence was the fellow I left off just last week who was saying, I encouraged J. Paul to work with John Reese, and he's with robbery and homicide, which is the murders in Los Angeles, which is even more dangerous, and he's the one who wanted to work with John Reese, and Reese works. He was put on the board of Western Goals by Otto Ambrose and Robert Milligan from the J. Pater Grace operation, and that is heavily involved with the Nazis in Germany and counterintelligence. So those 3 men, Schiller, Cleghorn, and Kilgo, left the PDID and went to 2 to the Anti-Terrorist Division and 1 to the robbery homicide. Our time is up now. It is the end of the hour. I have a lot on the LAPD, and I did a lot on me, so we'll have to stop now. And I'll be back with you next week. It's Mae Brussell, and we'll continue with a lot on the LAPD and other stories next week.